Detroit is the latest film by director Kathryn Bigelow, known for her works such as Zero Dark 30, The Hurt Locker, Point Break. And despite what the title suggests, this isn't a story of, the whole of the Detroit riots. It's not trying to encompass the whole riots, but more focusing on the specific case of the Algiers Hotel, and it's being told from the perspectives of multiple people on both sides about what actually went on in that motel.
This city has problems, but change is coming.
You never talk about what you saw here.
It's not that simple.
Change is coming.
You ever shoot anyone? I didn't do it.
Change is coming.
Detroit.
As I said in the intro, this is not really a film that, if you want to get an idea of what happened when with the Detroit riots and a full timeline of everything, this is not really the film for you. You're more looking for a documentary of some kind. It is focusing on the background of the riots in part, but it's more telling a small, focalized story so that it can kind of focus in on the details to show the story as a whole and the big picture. And the moments when it's doing this are definitely when the film shines the most. The whole kind of middle act of the film is just what happens at the Algiers Motel, and that is by far the best part of this film. The whole kind of second act of this film in the Algiers Motel sort of plays out, not specifically like a horror film, but more like a thriller. A historical thriller, and when it's doing these sequences, it's really enjoyable, it's really tense. You actually get involved with all of the characters, and the police officers are obviously very morally corrupt and awful, but at the same time they're sort of entertaining in the way that you can see how their sort of mental gymnastics are working out the situation, and how their complete bias is sort of giving them a completely false idea of what's going on. And at the same time, you've got the story of the residents in the hotel, which is sort of figuring out how can we get out of this situation, what do we say to actually convince them to our side. And so that's the thriller aspect. I would recommend that if you don't know anything about this case going in, that's probably the best, because as you're watching it, you don't know who's going to survive, who's going to make a mistake. Yeah, when it has this dynamic, it's when it's at its best with this film. I think this is definitely helped by the performances. I think Will Poulter isn't really an actor that's amazed me in the past, and I wouldn't say that he amazes me in this film, but he does have occasional little character moments that make the character much more dislikable and just enjoyable to watch, even though you hate him. Like, he's a very punchable character, and I think that Will Poulter does this very well. I will say that all of the kind of promotional material focusing a lot on John Boyega, I feel like that's mostly due to the Star Wars hype, because this is definitely a film without a star. It's as I said, it's focusing on the multiple perspectives of everyone involved in the motel, and for the most part, John Boyega doesn't actually have that much to do. Obviously, it's a telling of a true story, so you can't, rewrite everything to give him like all the best lines or whatever. But the promotional material definitely pushing John Boyega first makes it feel like he's going to have a much more important role in the story than he actually does. And so for acting-wise for him, I don't think that he gets that much to do for most of it, except for towards the end where he has one or two scenes where he gets to shine with the kind of minutiae of his performance, two scenes in particular, and they're not exactly blowout scenes. Like, they're not the scenes that people will come out and start quoting or saying, oh, that one's brilliant, but it's little moments where he gets to really shine the fact that he is a good actor. And it's not so much that I felt like I wanted more of him in this film particularly, but I think that it's a good showcase of, he is genuinely a good actor. It's not just that he's what's hot right now. And as for the rest of the cast in that section, as I said, the acting is all great in that section. I think that really they all sell the fear. And while I think that a few of the guests could have had a bit more of expansion on who their character is, because they are just kind of thrown into the second act and they just appear and that's it, I think that the actors did well with the roles that they were given. The reason that I've specifically pointed out this middle act is because I do have a problem with the beginning and the end. The beginning more so than the end, because it starts off with a very, I can't think of anything other than just ugly. It was a very ugly intro sequence telling you the cultural background of what was happening going into the riots, and it didn't feel like the big budget production that it was, and it didn't feel a particularly creative way to express it. It just felt like a student film, a student project really, and I don't know, I think it set the film off on a bad note where it could have been conveyed in a much more interesting way. That kind of style of the editing of the very intro is then incorporated slightly towards the end. It was very cheesy editing for some parts, and it was just stuff that, compared to the rest of the movie, it was like the rest of the movie was edited very well, and then it had odd moments where it felt like someone had almost done it in iMovie. That was just how I personally felt. I felt that it didn't take me out of it, but it was more just thinking that could have been done again, much more interestingly. And I'm not referring to the kind of documentarian parts where it does show up, old 4x3 like television footage of the actual riots in the beginning and the end, as well as showing photographs from the Algiers motel. And I like that sort of stuff, as it does root it in the reality of everything. It's just when they kind of incorporate just giving you exposition through the editing, I just find that it's very sloppy. Going back to the intro, maybe I just felt like it was more confusing because I didn't know that it was just going to be focusing on this Algiers motel, as again I didn't look into any promotional material, so I thought it was going to be covering the riots as a whole. It's very, very brief flashing glimpses of what starts the initial riot. There's a mini subplot that's established in the beginning of the what's happened with the riots that I kind of just still don't understand why they had to include that in there. Like the first 10 minutes or so of the film, it's very, very quick, and it's very much like you don't know what's meant to be important, what stuff is meant to last, as they show things like they film a speech by the local congressman that, it's him trying to talk down the riots, and then it's a thing where you think, why was that necessary in setting up the context for the rest of the riots? A TV show recently, The People vs. O.J. Simpson, they set up the riots very well in that show just by showing the footage, just giving you the context of the riot, and it was all just original footage, edited in a way that you knew the cultural background for the story that they were going to tell. And I feel like this film would have been better had they scrapped, not the character building stuff, where they do start introducing characters that appear in this Algiers motel act, but more just the stuff that's setting up characters in the riots that don't actually factor into the rest of the story. And then moving from the intro to my problems with the outro, I feel like the outro kind of didn't really know where it wanted to particularly end. Once the story leaves the Algiers motel, you're kind of left thinking, where is this going to go? And I feel like the story could have done more to show the direction that it was heading, and I think that it could have given more of a through line with the characters throughout the third act. But because it didn't have, one central character that it was really focusing on, it didn't know which character story to kind of wrap up on. It didn't know who to end the story on. And I think that was a problem with it, where it kind of felt like it wasn't an unsatisfying ending by any means, because, again, it's trying to recreate a historical event. It's just that it kind of felt like it didn't know what exactly was the rounding off point. As well as I think there were a few scenes could have hit harder than they did in the final product, in the third act. I've only got one more critical point to sort of make, but before that I just wanted to point out that, I said, the central act, the main bulk of the story does take place in this motel, and I like pretty much all of that. All of the, for people that have watched the film, it's sort of from the scene starting in the theatre, all the way through to, I suppose, the later courtroom stuff. I really like all of that, and I have very few problems with the filmmaking and the storytelling of all of that. It's just that the bits on the beginning and the end, I think, could have really just been, I think that they just could have been presented better, and I think that they could have been rounded off better. The last critical point that I wanted to make was that the camera work does go a bit overboard at times. It's all filmed in this very, not shaky cam, but documentarian, like the lens will actually zoom in and out of subjects, as well as sometimes if a character is running, it will follow behind them, and it's very shaky. And some parts, for most of the middle part, I think it worked really well. I think it really established this kind of the haste of everything and the frantic nature of everything, as well as kind of setting up as it made it feel much more of like a kind of live environment, and I think that it helped kind of sell the idea of the riots were going on just outside. But for other moments, I think that it was so frantic that I almost got flashbacks to the Jason Bourne films, where sometimes you can't even tell what's happening with a shot. There were one or two shots where it was either completely out of focus or so fast that I just kind of thought, what's the point in putting that shot in the edit except for to give the idea of a frantic motion. But sometimes I didn't feel like the frantic motion was needed to sell what was happening at the time. And some of these, the documentarian zooms, get it's so close to people, or aspects, as in it could just be someone's mouth, zooming in all the way from this distance into their mouth, and it gets a bit ridiculous, especially when some of them are either out of focus. No, it was getting to points where it was close, it was less documentarian and more closer to The Office, where it felt like they were just doing these push-ins, some people were going to turn to look to camera to give faces or reactions to things. Yeah, I just think, again, not for the entirety of the film, just the occasional shot goes a bit overboard with this, the zooms, or some shots are just completely out of focus. Again, I get it's the stylistic thing that they're going for with the film, but occasionally, in the odd, a shot every 5 minutes or so, it's distracting. As usual with my reviews, you know, I spent way too much time on the negative, not enough time on the positives. One thing I do want to mention is that this is clearly an awards film. It feels like it's the first of the season for this kind of awards films, and I hate already talking about awards this early, but it's very clear that that's kind of what they're going for, not just due to the message of the film and the subject of the film, but due to the film itself. I wouldn't be surprised if you see it nominated for a few awards. One in particular, which I just want to point out because it's something that I found interesting in the film, is that I think it's really good sound mixing. I think that it really does well to sell the environment that it's in, you know, the environment of the riots. Like when they're in the buildings, it feels like you can actually, you know, hear everything that's going on in the building, which work with that documentary and kind of camera style to really give a sense of, you know, a real sense of place. But yeah, it was definitely an enjoyable film. I wouldn't have any, you know, problem recommending it to most general moviegoers. You know, I certainly enjoy it more than the average biopic that comes out around this time of year. The closest comparison to a recent film I can think of is probably Just Imagine Spotlight, but with a lot more action in it. Like, as in it, the whole middle scene is just a tense scene. But it's that sort of, yeah, like I said, it's non-rose tinted history.